This is something that a lot of people have asked about. A lot of people who particularly are converts to Catholicism from other Christian denominations. What is up with Halloween? Can we celebrate this as Catholics? Can we engage with the rest of the world in this holiday, or is this really just something that we should be avoiding? And what do we do when I'm raising kids? Do I let my kids go trick-or-treating? Do I dress them up as, saints, or can I dress them up as ghosts and goblins, or all sorts of questions? So I figured that it might be helpful just to have a presentation on the history of Halloween and its relationship with Catholicism, with Christianity. So there are different opinions among Christians about the nature of Halloween. I remember when I was in high school, my geometry teacher, a wonderful woman, was a Baptist woman and did not celebrate Halloween. Wouldn't talk about it even, wouldn't even mention it, but she did not celebrate Halloween. And I was intrigued by that because I grew up Catholic, and going to Catholic schools and being around Catholic people, we always celebrated Halloween. We always went to Halloween parties and went trick-or-treating and did all the rest of it. My parents never dressed us up in anything outlandish. I think I was 3 years in a row, I was the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion from The Wizard of Oz. We did that kind of thing. And Halloween was always very harmless. But I never knew that there were any religious connections to Halloween, any religious undertones to it or either. We always thought it was just a secular, modern, harmless holiday that, everybody kind of celebrated. But then as I grew up and I started talking to other people, particularly Christians from other denominations, I started hearing this other side of Halloween, that it's pagan, it's evil, that it's a satanic Sabbath, right? This is the day when the devil gets to parade around, and we essentially serve him if we engage in this celebration. Well, when we look at this, there's got to be another answer. Halloween has got to be more than just a secular, modern, harmless holiday, and it's certainly got to be something different than a pagan, evil, satanic Sabbath. There is something in between, and we have to look at the history of the holiday to figure out what it is. And when we do so, we find actually that Halloween is a very Catholic thing. And that a lot of us are going to be uncomfortable with that, and we're going to have to readjust ourselves because a lot of us still have a little bit of Puritan blood flowing through our veins, and that's hard to get rid of. So when we think about the modern celebration of Halloween, before we even look at the historical parts of it, we know that Halloween has two faces, okay? And this is where a lot of parents struggle. On the one hand, you have the fun, spooky side of Halloween, right? With the trick-or-treaters and the jack-o'-lanterns, and you bob for apples, and you get candy and dress up and go to parties and all of that fun kind of thing. Most people don't have too much of a problem with this unless there is some real religious reason saying no participation in Halloween is appropriate. That's one face of Halloween. The other face of Halloween is the horror side. And I'm not putting any pictures of that because I will have nightmares. I don't do good with scary movies, right? But it's that whole other side of Halloween, the horror, the fright, the scare, the fangs, the blood, the gore, all of that kind of stuff, which has increasingly been added to the celebration of Halloween, and particularly in the last 60 years or so, but even more so in the last even 20. I don't remember as a kid Halloween being as frightening as it is now. But we have two faces of the modern celebration of Halloween. So what is a Catholic to do with all of this? And where is our place in it? What is always going to be the answer for us is to look back, to go back in history and say, how did this come about? Where does it come from? And what can we do with it? So the answer is historical. At least it starts off historically. So I'm going to give you the History Channel history of Halloween. And I'm calling this the History Channel history because I don't necessarily think everything that modern historians say about the history of Halloween is correct. I think they make a couple of assumptions, mainly because they don't understand church history very well. It's a big problem. It's a lacuna in a lot of their studies. They study, the ancient and medieval world, but they don't necessarily know the inner workings of the church and how that works. And so everything I'm going to give you what the scholars typically say, and I will nuance it as we go. So typically what you will hear if you watch the History Channel or read various things is that Halloween has dual origins, right? You get the pagan aspect, which goes all the way back to the Druids, running around their bonfires. And then you have Christianity, which was so good at taking all of those terrible pagan things and just baptizing them and making them Christian. Of course, this is the same thing that we hear for most of our holidays. We hear the same thing about Easter. We hear the same thing about Christmas, right? Because we see ancient practices that kind of look like the things that we do now, it must be that the church stole that from paganism. It must be that the church took these pagan things and made them her own. There may be some truth to that, but it's not completely true. But I'm going to give you the history nonetheless, what most people say about Halloween. Okay, so they say that it begins with this ancient Celtic feast that is not Samhain, by the way. That's Samhain. Samhain. It's a Gaelic word, and it means summer's end. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Samhain means summer's end. So the historians will say that this feast was something that the Celts, these were people who lived in the lands that are now occupied by Great Britain, Ireland, northern France, that kind of area, that this was a festival that the Celts, who lived 3,000 to 2,000 years ago, celebrated at the end of the summer. Not really the end of the summer, the end of the harvest period. Okay? They called it summer's end, and they began their new year on November 1st. So they celebrated their New Year's Eve with a special festival called Samhain. And this was supposed to be a big, huge blowout where you're kind of doing several things. One, you're celebrating a successful harvest. You're thanking the gods for a successful harvest. You made it through another summer. Your crops did well. But now you've got to go about appeasing the gods, and you've got to go about tempering the evil spirits for making sure that your winter is not deathly. Okay? Now you got to realize the Celts lived in the northern territories, which is kind of like us, right? Our winters come early and they stay late. And, when you don't have central heating, it's a dangerous time of year. It's dark and it's cold. And so they believed several different things about spirituality, how the gods worked, how evil spirits worked. And so their Samhain festival was about appeasing the gods, offering them sacrifices, mostly animal sacrifices, although sometimes even human sacrifices, to appease them, to make sure that they lived through the winter, that they didn't fall into disfavor. And so there was a common belief that as this year was coming to an end, right, and the new year was beginning, the new year began with the death of winter, that as that transition was happening, the veil in between worlds, the spirit world and this world, was very, 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 very thin. And so for that reason, on that night, you could experience any number of evil spirits, of different spiritual activity. And so this night was about warding that off. And what they would do is they would build these bonfires, they would chant incantations, they'd offer sacrifices, they'd wear animal skins in an effort to scare off evil spirits. And this became their festival. It became their yearly thing. Now, the other thing that you got to realize, too, is that this kind of thing was not abnormal for the Celts. The Druids led these kinds of ceremonies at the end of almost every month. So it's not like Samhain just stood out in the midst of a blank year, and this was a huge thing. In fact, relatively speaking, this was a minor festival for them. They did other things at other points of the year. But you can already kind of see how a historian might be looking and saying, oh, okay, we see the roots of modern Halloween here, right? They're putting on costumes, they're chasing away evil spirits, that kind of thing, okay? But just know that this is basically what we know about the practice of Samhain in the Celtic territories. This is just a picture of what their bonfires look like. Did you know that there is actually a modern movement of pagans who have kind of resurrected the Druid priesthood and enact out a lot of these pagan rituals? This is a picture of one of them, and so they're celebrating Samhain tomorrow as part of their practices here. One of the interesting things that they would do, and you can see that some of these things sounds a lot like what we do in Christianity. From these bonfires that they would have, they would extinguish the fires in their own hearths at home, and they would come and they would bring the fire from that new fire, and they'd bring it home with them, right? It's got a lot of Paschal stuff going on there, right? The Paschal candle, lighting the candles from the Paschal. But so here's the thing. Just because pagans and Christians do similar things doesn't mean that the Christians came and took these things from the pagans. What it means, in my opinion, and I'm not a historian, I'm not a scholar here, but what it says to me is that there are some fundamental human activities that have to do with the seasons and the passing of time and rituals that you're going to find throughout the course of humanity, no matter what religion you're talking about, right? So you can't just say, well, a pagan eats an apple and a Christian eats an apple, so the Christian obviously copied the pagan in eating the apple. And you don't do that. You know why? Because apples are available to everybody, and we eat them, and that's just what humans do. So it's not so much of a stretch to say, you've got this new fire, it symbolizes new life, I'm going to bring part of that home with me, in kind of the similar ways that we have these rituals that develop in Christianity. But then come the Romans, okay? So about 100 years before Christ and about 100 years after Christ, the Romans are on the mission to conquer those northern territories, okay? They want to get their hands on these lands that belong to the barbarians, if you will. And so they do. And by 43 AD, they've conquered almost all the Celtic territory that is available, with the exception of I think Scotland and Ireland, yeah. Now the Romans have no use for some of this bloody stuff that the Druids are doing. Human sacrifices, forget it. That's outlawed. You can't do those things anymore. But they do allow, they're very permissive of a lot of the Celtic practices and traditions and rituals to continue as they had been. And so what you find is during this time, and for the next 400 years, you've got this melding together of Roman practice with Celtic practice. The Druids are gone, they've been put away, but now this sort of new Roman Celtic cultural thing is starting to bloom. As a result of this, there are two Roman practices that came into these territories. One of them is the observance of Feralia, which is a festival that took place in February, which honored the Roman spirits of the dead. Okay? And then the other one was the worship of Pomona, which is the Roman goddess of fruitful abundance. She's associated with orchards and trees and everything like that. So what happened was these two festivals that took place throughout the Roman Empire got merged with Samhain. And they were celebrated kind of all at the same time with Samhain. Now, you had to replace some of the things that were going on at the observance of Samhain, like these animal sacrifices with something else. The Druids are gone. And so the Romans kind of provided this. But this was well on its way to kind of the old Samhain falling out of vogue. Okay? With the Druids gone, it's not going to stay for long. But some of the cultural associations with Samhain, like bonfires, will continue. Okay? Because this is also their new year, you got to remember. And so even though they're going to take the Druidic religious practices out of Samhain, they've still got an attachment to how they're going to celebrate their new year. And so, yeah, they're going to go outside, they're going to light these fires, and now the Romans are coming in and now they're remembering the dead. They're not necessarily warding off evil spirits, but they are remembering the dead. Yeah, if you'd like to, please.
The Druids were priests for this. Catholics, did the Romans actually outlaw that?
Well, I don't know the exact history of when the Druids fell out and how they fell out, but Rome certainly outlawed many of the practices that they were engaged in. They were, but they really liked order. Yeah, they really liked order, right? The Romans really liked order. They wanted things to be well structured, and you couldn't have a well structured society if the priests were taking people and murdering them for ritual sacrifice. That just doesn't make for good polity, right? So, nope, sorry, Druids, you can't do that anymore. And we're also going to trim down some of your other practices. And there was also a desire to make them part of the Roman Empire too. You know, we'll respect some of your things here, but now you're Roman, okay? This is very similar to what we see in Israel at the time of Christ, right? The Romans occupied that space in Israel. Now, they were allowed to keep some of their practices, but they had to completely tailor themselves to the conditions of Rome, right? The Jewish priests could govern the Israelites, but only within the context of the Sanhedrin, which is a Roman-appointed, government, essentially. So, it's mixing and matching, but I don't know the history enough to say whether the Druids kind of were all kicked out of town at once or if they just kind of fell to the wayside. But it definitely, when the Romans came, the clock was ticking. But then Christianity comes in. Okay, we know that after Rome invades, Christianity is on its way too. Now, this is a continuation of the story linearly, but it's not going to continue on as if it's the next part of the story. So this is going on concurrently. Okay, so Christianity, for the first 3 centuries, we know after Jesus died and rose, persecution in the church, terrible persecution for the first 3 centuries. Okay, and people died left and right. They were being fed to wild animals. They're having their heads chopped off. They were suffering terrible, terrible deaths. These are the martyrs. And of course, the early Christians, we know this from their writings, and we know this from the churches they built, and we know this from their iconography. They had such an amazing reverence for the martyrs because they were willing to give up their lives. They were so moved by this. And so very, very, very early in Christianity, we see several behaviors on the part of Christians in regards to their martyrs. One is they would collect the relics of those who had died. Their bodily relics, their physical relics, so bones, right? Their remains, but also their artifacts. We see this in Acts of the Apostles in chapter 19, right? They're gathering up the handkerchiefs and clothing of Paul, and these things are making miracles happen, okay? So there's this attachment first to the remains of the relics, of the martyrs, rather. Then on the anniversary of their deaths, a feast was celebrated in honor of their rebirth, of their moving from death to new life. And as time passed, very interestingly enough, dioceses would honor each other's martyrs and even exchange relics and veneration, right? So Antioch would hear about a martyr in Rome, and they would start telling the story of the martyrs of Rome. And so Rome would then send some relics of such and such a martyr to Antioch. And then Antioch would celebrate those martyrs now every year. And so eventually what we find is we start seeing this cult of the saints building up. All right? Cult not meaning, occult practices, right? Like New Age stuff, but the Christian people engaging in the reverence and veneration of the martyrs. Now things got really tough towards the end here in the last 3 centuries. As we dip into the end of the 3rd, beginning of the 4th century, the Emperor Diocletian came to power, and he was ruthless. And there were many, 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 many martyrs that lost their lives during his reign. And they grew in such large number that it was becoming impossible to keep up with them all. And it was becoming impossible to celebrate their anniversaries with the same reverence and dedication that they had celebrated the other martyrs. So as a result, a common feast of all martyrs began to be celebrated in different places on different days throughout the year. And so what you might have is in a given place, you might have a feast of all martyrs, 4 times a year, for example. And then another place you might have a feast of all martyrs once a year. And this was just a way that you could venerate the innumerable people who were in your community who were getting slaughtered because of Diocletian. But the legalization of Christianity happened not long thereafter. I put the wrong date there. It's not 315. What is the date for the Edict of Milan? It's not 315, it's 313, I think. Anyway, the Edict of Milan, Constantine is the emperor. Constantine says, guess what? Christianity, you're golden. Okay? Not only am I going to make it legal, I'm going to make it the religion of the empire. So you go from martyrdom to power, essentially, overnight. And what happens here now is the Christian church can kind of start to figure out itself. It's coming up from the underground. It doesn't have to fight for its life. And good things start to happen. So one of the things that Constantine did, this was very significant for the history of Christianity. Constantine moved the seat of the empire from Rome to Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul. So he packed up and moved, and he went over to Constantinople, leaving the Bishop of Rome basically in charge in the western half of the empire. And so the Pope, this is when the Pope really started to grow, not only in religious power, but in temporal power as well, because the emperor was all the way on the other side of the Mediterranean. But 3 centuries later, okay, so Constantine is long gone. The church is really kind of getting itself figured out here. The Byzantine emperor at the time, 3 centuries later, around 609, gave Pope Boniface IV the Pantheon. So the Pantheon in Rome, that big, beautiful building, right, which was like the epicenter of where the Roman gods were worshipped. The Byzantine emperor, who was the Roman emperor, gave this building to Pope Boniface. And Pope Boniface said, thank you very much, I'll take it, and I'm going to turn it into a church. And I'm going to dedicate this church in honor of the Blessed Virgin Mary and all martyrs. Okay? This was particularly appropriate because there were many martyrs in Rome, but not just any martyrs in Rome. This is where Peter and Paul were martyred. Okay? So there is definitely a reverence for the martyrs, particularly in Rome. So when he does this, he does it on May 13th in 609. And when he does this, the dedication of a church is not just another day on the calendar. As you're going to find out next year, we're celebrating the 150th anniversary of the cathedral. It's going to be a year of celebrations because it's a lot more than just the dedication of a building. It's the faith that's behind it. It's the people that's within it. It's the saints that are revered there. Everything. It's very important. And so when this church was dedicated, there was a big festival that happened. And it was so big, of course, that, you prepare for it the day before. There's a vigil that's associated with this. And there's lots of feasting that's happening. There's lots of dancing and celebrating and everything like that. And this becomes a yearly thing because you celebrate the anniversary now, not just of this church, but of all the martyrs. So this became, in Rome, like the first All Saints' Day, if you will. But it's still called All Martyrs. Okay? Some historians, this is where modern history, their methods, I question. Some of the historians will say that Pope Boniface consecrated the church and established the Feast of All Martyrs on May 13th because there was an ancient Roman feast of the Lemures, which was a day that malevolent and restless spirits were cast out, right? But this is the thing. I don't think Pope Boniface had any clue about this pagan feast day. This is centuries removed from any of those kinds of things. The more likely reason why he chose this day, May 13th, other than maybe whatever construction he was doing to it finished by that time, was that in the East, there was already a feast day honoring the martyrs, and it was occurring regularly on the Sunday following Pentecost. Now, because East and West were not always following the same calendar, using the calendar that we had, he chose May 13th. And that kind of put you in the vicinity of when Pentecost is going to end, when spring is going to begin, and therefore we can celebrate this every year, and it will put us in relationship with the East. But see, church historians don't consider that part of it, because they don't necessarily understand the distinction between the church in the West and the church in the East, and the fact that they have different liturgical calendars and everything like that. I think that's a far likelier reason, and that it has nothing to do with any pagan festivals. The reality is, too, is that there are so many different kinds of pagan religions in Europe in these early centuries that you could probably find a pagan feast day on any day of the year and say, oh, look, those Christians, they just took that pagan feast day and made it their own. I don't think that's what happened here. But anyway, so what we have is now we have in Rome, this is significant because Rome kind of sets the standard for the rest of the West, we have a feast day for the dedication of a church, and it's all about the martyrs. So this becomes the first martyrs, All Martyrs Day. And soon other dioceses and other places start to celebrate the dedication of this church as well, which is the reason why you probably remember a couple of years ago we had it fall on a Sunday. There are a couple of churches in Rome whose dedication we celebrate every year. The dedication of the Lateran Basilica, the dedication of St. Mary Major, the dedication of St. Peter's, right? So, like, the celebration of the dedication of a church is a big deal, and this would spread beyond Rome itself. So this practice of venerating all the martyrs on May 13th is starting to unfold. But then a century later, Pope Gregory III, he didn't build a new church, he didn't consecrate a new church, but he built an oratory. He built a chapel within the old Constantinian Basilica in Rome. This was, we've got the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome now. That's the second church. There was a church that was there before it that Constantine built. So Pope Gregory in the 700s built a new oratory in St. Peter's, and he dedicated it now in honor of all the saints. And so what happened was this brought about another festival and another feast day. It didn't replace the May 13th festival, but because this was taking place in a papal church, it kind of grew in prominence over it. And a few decades later, November 1st, which was the day that he consecrated this chapel, became the day throughout Western Christianity when all the saints were venerated. Okay? Do you follow all of that? It's kind of an interesting thing. But it all has to do with the dedication of churches. It has nothing to do with what are the pagans up to and how can we do it better. Okay? So meanwhile, though, as all of this is going on, Christianity is continuing to spread And it's beginning to spread now to the Celtic lands as well. And of course, we all know the stories of Augustine of Canterbury and of course, St. Patrick, right, bringing Christianity to these northern territories. And so it's happening. And by the 6th century, we see other things start to go on in the development of Christianity as well. So, prayers for the dead start to be offered. And they start to be offered primarily in these monasteries that are being built here, there, and everywhere. Prayers for the dead. And what we find is that many of them begin to celebrate these solemn ceremonies. We don't know if they were necessarily masses or whether they were something else, but these ceremonies that were being offered for the repose of the souls of the deceased. And this was happening then on an annual basis. Now, by the 10th century, we hear, look at this name, Wittekind of Corvey, right? He attests that at a monastery in Saxony, which is where he was from, this ceremony had been observed for years. And we don't know what he means when he says years, but he says it's a time-honored tradition that this ceremony for the repose of the souls of the deceased was being observed every year on October 1st. Okay? So this is, we're getting ready to go to All Souls Day here. We're seeing the concurrent emergence of this. Around the year 1000, though, we have St. Odilo of Cluny, right? This is a very prominent monastery, the Abbey of Cluny. St. Odilo, for whatever reason, chose November 2nd as the day when the Abbey of Cluny and all of the monasteries that Cluny is responsible for, this was going to be the day that they celebrated their ceremonies for the repose of the souls of the dead. And that this was going to be marked by a penitential nature with almsgiving and prayers and sacrifices for the holy souls in purgatory. Of course, this is all happening at the same time that the Church's doctrine of purgatory is really being unfolded, and we're really coming to understand this. And so it makes sense that we wouldn't see these ceremonies take place until around this time. But what happened is because Cluny was so prominent in the following years, and it didn't take much, other monasteries, not just the ones who were subject to Cluny, but other monasteries in the area, and then other dioceses, and eventually even Rome itself, started doing these ceremonies, these prayers for the dead on November 2nd. And so what we find is that by the first millennium, we've got All Saints' Day in place on November 1st, and All Souls' Day in place on November 2nd. And again, this has nothing to do, as far as we can see, with any pagan practice. It is simply the regular, ordinary goings-on in the church. When is this going to work? This is what we're going to do. And these little accidents of history. My guess for St. Odilo, for choosing to November 2nd as the day for All Souls, is that it makes sense that if you're going to honor on All Saints' Day, not just those canonized saints who are remembered at the altar, but all those unnamed saints, all those in heaven, it makes sense at the same time that you're developing the doctrine of purgatory that you, the next day, pray for all of the souls who are not yet in heaven but are on their way. You keep them together. So there was probably that theological reason that joined these 2 days together. So, now we have these two things going on, okay? We have all the festivals of Samhain and the Roman practices going on in the Celtic lands, and then you have Christianity doing its thing concurrently. And I already mentioned that while this is happening, the Celtic people are being converted to Christianity. But as the Druids fell off, and as the Roman influence waned and Christianity took hold, these festivals, they stopped happening. They weren't celebrating Samhain the way that they had been. They hadn't been celebrating Samhain under Roman occupation as they had when the Druids were around. It was slowly coming to its natural end. But a lot of the same traditions and a lot of the same culture that developed around harvest celebrations, the end of the year, all of those kinds of things, they still clung to. And they would be doing this in a different way than people in Rome would be, because the end of the harvest in Northern Ireland is going to look very different than the end of the harvest in Sicily, right? It's going to be a little bit, well, it's going to be dramatically different, okay? But they're still holding on to their feasting and their bonfires and their costumes, but not with any of the pagan attachments to them. Now, as the rest of Western Christianity is settling its mind on having All Saints and All Souls on November 1st and on November 2nd, it just so happens then that they have to do something with this, because this is where they had been celebrating their new year, and we've got these feasts. And so the Celtic people inevitably, right, started combining what they had been doing, their cultural traditions, along with these feast days, All Saints and All Souls, which is why you will hear people say that until recently, and by recently in the last 500 years, there was really no Halloween, as we call it, outside of Ireland, England, and Scotland. That they kind of had the monopoly on that because of this, because of the merging of the two feast days with their prior practices. I think there is some truth to this. I do think there is some truth to this, because the power and the influence of Samhain was not the pagan ritual sacrifices that were happening, but it was the changing of the seasons, right? We all have rituals at the changing of the seasons. We all do it, and they're part of who we are. And so those would have been very powerful, and it would have made perfect sense to combine, knowing that Rome is celebrating a great festival on the night before the Vigil of All Saints, to have a festival themselves, celebrating all the saints, with bonfires and feasting and costumes and everything else that they had been using. Okay, that's one part of it. So this is my musing on this. Again, I'm not a historian, so I can't say this with any certainty. But I think it's coincidental, first, that the Feast of All Saints and All Souls falls anywhere near Samhain. I don't think that was planned. I don't think anybody sat down and said, those Celtic people, we want to get them on board, so we are going to make these two feast days, and that is going to give them the perfect excuse to merge and leave their pagan practices for their Christian practices. They were already Christian by the time these two feast days even came about. All right? It was at least 300 years. They'd been Christian for 300 years. You don't need to get them to leave their pagan practices. They'd already left them. But, again, some of the external manifestations of that have to do with the seasons and the harvest and the end of year stuff, those remained. And that became a particular Celtic addition to how these feast days were celebrated. I don't think Boniface IV or Gregory III or St. Odilo had any concept of Samhain or anything related to it. I don't think it was on their radar. They had other things to worry about than, oh, were the Druids, celebrating this minor end of year festival back then? Well, let's hijack that. I don't think that was on their radar at all. Okay, so this is now where we can start talking about Halloween coming into its own. Because now what we have is we have two concrete feast days, All Saints and All Souls, and we have the Celtic people in the north with the day before that they are using as a particular way of celebrating and feasting. Okay? So let's talk about Halloween as it is. The word Halloween indicates that it's historically tied to All Saints, because it comes from the Middle English word meaning All Hallows Mass, right? You know how we have Christmas, right? We have All Hallows Mass, which means All Saints Mass. The Feast of All Saints is called All Hallows Mass. The day before is All Hallows Even. And when you realize how language develops and how shortcuts are taken, it's not hard to see how All Hallows Eve became Halloween, right? Language develops and people take shortcuts. Now, in the lands that were once occupied by the Celtic people, so mostly Ireland and mostly in England, these 3 days then became something of a triduum, okay? And it became known as All Hallows Tide, right? You know how we have the triduum during Holy Week, Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Easter Vigil? Well, the Celtic people, they were really attached to that day before All Hallows Mass. That was All Hallows Even, and it was a day for festivity. Now, at first, throughout the rest of Christendom, All Hallows Eve was not observed in any particular way among Christians. Okay? It didn't have its own Mass. It didn't have its own office in the breviary. It just was the day before All Saints. And in Rome, there might be a festival because, the consecration of that chapel. But of course, once the Constantinian Basilica was leveled and a new basilica was built on top of it, you're not necessarily going to be celebrating just the consecration of a building, the dedication of a chapel, but it will just be the regular, ordinary celebration of the feast day. Now, over time, as people had a chance to sit with these feast days, especially the Celtic people, customs and celebrations started just coming up organically. And of course, the customs and celebrations that the Celtic people developed would have been suited to their history, their landscape, their seasons, their weather, all of that, which of course, because it took place at the same time of year, would have similarities with the celebration of Summer's End, of Samhain. But it would take many centuries for Halloween, as we know it, to develop its own particular character. So let's look at what's going on in some of these places during these centuries. So you gotta love the Irish. They make great distinctions here, okay? So one of the things that they figured is, okay, we have a day where we can honor all the saints, so all the souls in heaven, right? We also have a day right after where we can honor and pray for all of the souls in purgatory. But there's another set of souls that we may be having to worry about here. The souls of the damned, okay? Now, we're not going to honor them, but we want to show them that we haven't forgotten them, because if we have forgotten them, they may find a way to come and not forget us. So it became a practice among the Irish peasants. One of the things that they would do on Halloween, on All Hallows Even, would be taking pots and pans or whatever they had, and they would make noise. And they would do this not to scare off the souls in hell, not like they believed that these souls were roaming the earth, although some of them may have. There may have been superstition that crept in too. I mean, you can't fight that. I bet you many of your mothers believe that if you see a black cat, it's bad luck, or if you step on a crack or brack's going to be broken, something like that. You can't stop superstition from coming in, but at the teaching, at the level of the church and at the level of the celebration of these holidays, that superstition wasn't there. But they did believe if we make noise, maybe that will just appease the damned souls so they won't bug us at all, okay? And so it became a practice. And of course, pots and pans become noisemakers, become other things, become other ways to make noise, right? And so you'll see any number of different banging on sticks, shouting, making music, all of those things would have been an organic development of that. It's very interesting in France. France does not have any of this, at least southern France, doesn't have any of this experience of Samhain. But they've got their own thing that they're dealing with. So the bubonic plague is coming through and it's wiping people out left and right. In some places, half the population is getting wiped out. It's absolutely crazy. And this forces the medieval people, this is in the late Middle Ages, this forces them to confront death in a way that they've never had to confront death before. And they're becoming obsessed with it. They're becoming obsessed with their own eternity, where they're going to spend their afterlife. And so one of the things that starts happening is that artists in France start painting these really amazing murals and various paintings on the walls of cemeteries and in tombs, whatever, of something called the Danse Macabre, the dance of death. And what this shows is it shows usually the devil or some demons or some skeletons linked arm in arm with people of every walk in life. Popes, kings, ladies, knights, the whole lot of them, peasants, everybody. Linked arm in arm, and drawing them into the tomb. Showing, artistically speaking, that nobody can avoid death. Okay? This is the time when we start seeing a lot of the macabre art that would dominate the period. So lots of skeletons, lots of skulls, lots of crossbones, right? All of that was supposed to help you meditate on death. And what they would do is on All Souls Day, November 2nd, they would actually act this out. This actually became a dance. And so they would dress up in costumes, from the Pope to the peasant. And they would have somebody dressed as a devil, and they would have people dressed as skeletons. And they would all link arms, and they would sing some of these frightening, drab songs, and they would act out this Danse Macabre. And that was their way of dealing with the bubonic plague. It wasn't something that they were just going to run away from and be afraid of. They were going to confront it, and they were going to deal with it, and they were going to almost make it beautiful, if you will. Okay? This is a picture of what it looked like. So you see people of every walk in life. You have a lady with her crown on, you get a peasant, and you get all of these skeletons with the tomb in the middle, which means death doesn't discriminate. It comes for everybody. Okay? So we're already now seeing in France another one of those customs that is going to have an impact on how we celebrate Halloween today. Then in England, another thing is going on, okay? This time it's a little bit different. 1605, Guy Fawkes. Everybody familiar with Guy Fawkes, right? God bless his heart. He's not happy with Protestant England, and he wants to blow up the king in Parliament. There's a plot. They're like, hey, gunpowder, this stuff's powerful. We can do something. We can make England Catholic again. They failed. They failed miserably. And Guy Fawkes was arrested, and he was hanged. Every year, and this still happens in England if you go to England, they have a big, huge festival on Guy Fawkes Day. And what they do is they have a bonfire, and they have an effigy of Guy Fawkes, and they throw Guy Fawkes into the fire, and they watch his effigy burn. In the earlier days, too, what would happen is you'd have the little, revelry going on. People would put on masks. They still put on these masks today in England. And they would go door to door to Catholic homes, people who were not out celebrating, right? And they would knock on their door at ungodly hours of the night and demand cakes and beer and other things too. So we're kind of seeing, again, other traditions that will eventually come. But so now, what do we do with all of this? We got to synthesize everything here before we go one step farther, okay? Because this is all a bunch of concurrent happenings going on. So just to recap. So early Celtic people, they celebrated their new year on November 1st. The height of their celebration took place on October 31st as the Feast of Samhain. Celebration was an admixture of harvest festival, religious practices, all regarding the protection of themselves from evil spirits throughout the winter. Okay, fact number one. Fact number two, Romans come in, Druid practices go down, Roman practices merge. They start adding the commemoration of the dead and more harvest stuff into celebration of Samhain. Three, concurrently, the persecution of the church is going on at this time, and the cult of the martyrs and the cult of the saints is coming up. And during this time, we have, this is a large period of time, 1,000 years, we have 2 universal feast days for the Western Church, All Saints' Day, November 1st, All Souls' Day, November 2nd. As Christianity is spreading through the Celtic lands, many of the cultural traditions that were associated with Samhain become linked with the local observance of All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. Now, these traditions were not, like I've been saying, intrinsically linked to pagan religion, but were more seasonal harvest celebrations, right? Local celebratory customs. 5. Contrary to what some scholars believe, this is me probably stepping beyond my competence, but saying it anyway, that the merging of the Samhain practices and Christianity is coincidental and not contrived. So the history and the emergence of All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, which is really the history behind the modern observance of Halloween, has nothing to do with Celtic culture. In fact, these feast days were established without any knowledge of what was going on in the Celtic lands. And it takes several centuries for Halloween now to develop its own culture. It is starting predominantly in these Celtic lands because they have these particular kind of harvest festivals that they're celebrating, and they've created kind of a triduum with All Saints and All Souls, adding October 31st as All Hallows Eve. But we got to get back on subject here, okay? Why do people have a problem with Halloween, right? Why don't people want to celebrate it? Well, we've already talked about that, right? They believe it's pagan, it's evil, and it's satanic. But the real problem is the Reformation. It's not history that reveals the church was being pagan. It comes with the Reformation, and this is where things begin to change, okay? So Christians have different opinions on Halloween because Christians have different opinions about theology and doctrine. Unless you are a high church Lutheran or Anglican, you're probably not going to have any use for the Feast of All Saints, okay? And even if you are a high church Anglican or Lutheran, you have no use for the doctrine of purgatory. And so All Souls' Day makes no sense to you, okay? So already Halloween is being undermined by the Reformation because the anchoring feast days for Halloween are being discounted, all right? They're being denied theologically. So the more common objection that we hear to the observance of Halloween that is pagan or evil and satanic, these are coming mostly from Protestant Christians, especially those of the more strident Reformed traditions, okay? But the bigger problem, historically speaking, is not Halloween. That's just the modern little scapegoat, right? The bigger problem is what Halloween precedes, and it's All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, okay? So ultimately, behind a lot of the objections that we hear to the celebration of Halloween is not really, oh, it's the devil's holiday. It's, we don't believe what Catholics believe about All Saints and All Souls. So Halloween then makes no sense because that's the vigil of All Saints. Get rid of All Saints, get rid of All Souls, you have no reason for Halloween, okay? Now, the fact that the church had observed All Saints and All Souls' Day in some fashion for at least 1,000 years prior to the Reformation, that was a conundrum to deal with. The history question is a pesky question to answer. And so, unable to answer these questions, it was just easier to say, and this is why we hear it all the time, and it drives me crazy, oh, the Catholic Church just adopted those practices from paganism, right? There was a time in England, believe it or not, where Christmas was outlawed because those darn papists stole it from the pagans, right? With their Christmas trees and it's on December 25th, which is, a pagan festival day, blah, blah, blah. Okay? That's the lazy man's argument. When you do the history, you find that those connections are not really there. So, not only were there liturgical observances of these two feast days then impermissible according to theology, but their cultural celebrations had to be outlawed too. And this becomes even more apparent when you get to the New World. On the continent, you're not going to find a whole lot of emphasis on October 31st in the first place. You're going to find that, like I said, more in the Celtic territories, more in the north. But what happens when you get the New World? Okay? That changes everything. because the Puritans are leading the way to the New World. And for the Puritans, the church in England isn't strident enough. It's not strict enough, okay? And so they're not going to have any use for any of this funny business that's going on. And so Halloween in America, maybe because of the insistence of the Puritans that this was bad, this is when it really starts to come into its own. So the Puritan colonialists, like I said, believe that the English Reformation didn't go far enough. They encountered two problems that drove them crazy when they came to America. One is all of their fellow Englishmen were coming with their beloved Guy Fawkes Day celebrations. And they didn't like that because it was just a big party. They were drinking, they were making noise, they were all sorts of things. Now granted, this was happening on November 5th, not on October 31st. But again, it's all in the same timeline, all in the same, week here. So they started to merge and they started to fall together, especially when you've got Catholics and other Protestants from England who maybe observed All Saints' Day or All Souls' Day and maybe had some kind of Halloween celebration. Eventually what started happening is these guys started coming together and having common Halloween-like celebration. Now, what took a while with this is that, of course, in the northern part of this country, it was very Puritan, but in the southern part, that's where Catholics could live in relative peace and harmony. So it's definitely the case that the Puritans were having much more difficult time with Guy Fawkes Day. You weren't having the Puritans encounter many Catholics. But they were still in the country and they were still contributing to the modern celebration of Halloween. Now this became even more prominent as Catholic immigrants from the continent started to come and they started to mix, they started to intermarry. And they've got the English immigrants now with their traditions and the Irish immigrants and the French, right? So you've got the Dance Macabre coming. You've got all of the Irish traditions now. You've got the English tradition of Guy Fawkes. And what you find is now households are molding, mending, coming together, and a lot more attention is getting placed on October 31st. And that becomes, slowly over time, the day for all of this feasting and all of this revelry. But it's also becoming secular, because if you're not Catholic, you're not celebrating the Feast of All Saints or All Souls. And so it just becomes a day for fun or for mischief. But for Catholics, it becomes a day where you're actually preparing for a great feast day, the celebration of All Saints, and also for a penitential day. Okay? And it becomes a day for you to work out all of the human stuff that these feast days bring up, like life and death and sickness and the seasons and all of those kinds of things. Halloween becomes a day where you work all of that out, right? Not that you get it out of your system, but you deal with it in sort of ritual, tradition, custom kind of way. The problem is that as Catholics were getting persecuted, and we were persecuted in this country up until, well, the election of John F. Kennedy even. What happened is that Catholics more and more tried to blend in with everybody else. And so Halloween, which had been the Irish Catholic preparation day for All Saints, started to lose its spiritual dimension. Catholics started stepping away from that and started just joining in with all of the fun and revelry without any of the spirituality. And what would end up happening then is in our own day, eventually, slowly over time, the more you take out the spiritual elements of Halloween, what you're left with is this empty shell of death, of violence, of horror, of gore, and of all of that without God, without His grace. Now those things, people are frightened of those things. And you're rightfully frightened of those things. But you shouldn't be frightened of them because of Christ's death and resurrection. In fact, Christ's death and resurrection brings meaning to all of those things. And so the celebration of a deathly holiday, as Halloween once was in these Irish lands, it makes a lot of sense. Because you can look death in the face, you can look at judgment in the face, and you can say in almost a mocking manner, "Ha, you don't have victory over me. Christ has victory over you." But once you take that out, that's when Halloween starts to become something else. And unfortunately, that's kind of what we're left with now. So, as Catholics, the answer to the dilemma of Halloween and what do we do with our kids and trick or treat and all that kind of stuff is not abandon Halloween and stay at home and pray the rosary on Halloween night. I mean, if you want to pray the rosary on Halloween, you should pray the rosary on Halloween night anyway. You should pray the rosary every night. But the answer is not just to say, nope, we're done with that. The answer, I think, is to recapture what Halloween is and what it should be. And the reality is that it's a Catholic, deeply Catholic holiday that is meant to help us celebrate All Saints and to help us celebrate the Feast of All Souls. So there's a couple of things that maybe we can talk about. So Father Steve Gunrow, I think this is helpful for us to consider. That at its core, Halloween, in its early days, and you know what? Even if you want to make a connection between Samhain and Halloween, if you want to go down that route, it's still there. The basics of that celebration, the basics of Halloween as it's been celebrated, are these three things. Some form of masquerading, which was always a part of festivals and celebrations. Now we only tend to put on masks and dress up for costume parties, but you got to figure, when people went to a ball, they dressed up, they put on masks. That's how they celebrated, right? Lots of masquerading. That was part of celebrating in those days. And so if you were going to have a holy day, these were the three things that you did to celebrate those holy days. You had some kind of masquerading. You had some kind of feasting with festivities, local festivities that, grew up through custom and over time. And then a particular way to focus on the supernatural. Now, in our postmodern world where we believe that science has an answer to everything, and that if it hasn't answered something, that it's just a matter of time before it will answer, it has no use for the supernatural. But in these days, and I think rightfully so, they saw the supernatural everywhere. Everywhere. Not just in calamities and in sickness, but there was an angel or a demon behind everything. Which is very interesting and fits in well with what St. Thomas says about the creation of the world. He believes that God created the world through the ministry of angels, right? And that he creates us also through the ministry of angels. When God says, "Let there be light," that angels assist with this. It's a world that is very different from the way that modern man thinks about things, but not necessarily for the right reasons, right? I think that we threw the baby out with the bathwater here. So focusing on the supernatural and all of its beautiful forms and also in some of its scary forms is an important part of being Catholic. And it's an important part of celebrating feast days. So these three things play into all of the feast days of the church year. When you consider All Saints and All Souls Day, they take on their own particular meaning because of the nature of these feast days. Not just the subject matter of the feast days, but also the time of year that they're happening. They're happening at a time when things are dying, right? So these feast days are about people who have died at a time when things are dying. It makes sense that your observance of these feast days is going to involve an interaction with death in some way or another. So here are some ideas about ways that we can recapture in our own lives Halloween as Catholics. So first we got to change our mindset with this. We're not going to be able to change the mindset of the world, okay? This is this is going to, for a while, going to be about, fangs and blood and werewolves and vampires and all that other kind of stuff, right? That's what Halloween's going to be about. And it's going to be about, Michael Myers and Freddy Krueger and haunting and all that kind of stuff. We're not going to be able to do anything with that. Although I don't necessarily think that all of that is bad. I think that if it's subject to the grace and power of Christ, that those things can be a good thing, and that they can lead us into a deeper understanding of the mystery and the paradox of life and death. But anyway, here are some things that we can do for our own selves. One is that we can have a healthy understanding of death, that we can be able to mock it and to fear it at the same time. The macabre has to have a place in our lives. One of the, I think one of the most obvious celebrations that we have of this, and Sister Pat can speak of this, and Sister Elsa can too, in Latin American culture, particularly Mexico, they have the Day of the Dead, where they're at cemeteries, and they are building elaborate displays with skulls, and they're leaving food out, and those kinds of things. And you might say, oh, that's very pagan, or that's very macabre. We can't go that way. But they're looking death in the face. And not only that, it's not all drab. It's very colorful too. It's very colorful. So it's an honest celebration of the inevitable, of death, that we're all going down into the tomb. And it's a modern way of doing the danse macabre, right? You dress death up and you dance with it, realizing that you can mock it and fear it at the same time because Christ has conquered it. So if our guts are telling us, I don't want my children engaged in any Halloween practices because skeletons and ghouls and ghosts and death are going to frighten them, I'm going to work on that a little bit, because that's an important part of understanding what Christ has done for us. All right? It's the same reason why in every Catholic church in the world we have a crucifix in our churches and not just a cross, right? We have a dead man hanging in our churches. It doesn't get more macabre than that. But we have appropriated that into our lives as Catholics. It's not startling for us in the same way that it is startling for, say, a Baptist to come in and see Christ on the cross. We have to do the same thing with death in our own lives, in our own mindsets. We have to become okay with it because it's coming for us, every single one of us. These feast days are meant to help us to do that. And Halloween, if celebrated properly, can be a good way to kind of scare us into that, right? You ever watched a scary movie, particularly one that has a religious connotation to it, maybe an exorcism or something, where you're like, oh boy, I better get my life in order. I don't want to be possessed. I don't want to have, those things. Those kinds of things are good, where you are jolted in a sense and moved towards righteousness. It's the same reason why Grandpa might tell kids those little cautionary tales, right? Don't go down there because old so-and-so went down there and he drowned, and I hear that on cool winter nights he can still be seen walking around, right? You do that to give children a healthy fear of danger. And Halloween can help us to do the same thing. Being scared is not necessarily a bad thing. And so the scary element of Halloween is also not necessarily a bad thing. And the second thing, this is really important, that we need to recognize that there is a world outside of that which we can sense. And it's not all heavenly. Okay? Halloween, All Saints, All Souls, helps us to remember that we are not alone. Okay? And that we have friends and we have adversaries who are powerful, who we can't see, who are there. And there is a battle going on for our souls. And that is not passé Christianity. That is still the teaching of the church. Our souls are immortal. And we will spend eternity in heaven or in hell. And we better be thinking about these realities in the here and now. These feast days, Halloween with its macabre sense, can help us to do that too. We have to understand too that the living can have an impact on the dead, and the dead can have an impact on the living. That's what the communion of saints is all about, right? We are not worlds apart from heaven, okay? I mean, we're light years away, but it's also right here. I mean, it's closer than we can imagine, right? Because it's not defined by space or time. And so the church in heaven and the church on earth and the church suffering in purgatory, they're all in relation with each other. These feast days help us to remember that. They also help us to remind ourselves, though, that we pass from this experience of the body of Christ to the next experience of the body of Christ only through the gate of death. Only through the gate of death. Okay? And we should be prepared for that and okay with that, because you're not going to live forever. And that's a serious gate to pass through. Jesus says an awful lot about it. And he talks about it being pretty narrow and pretty hard to get to. So we need help. We need help from the saints in heaven, and we have a role to play in helping those who are being purged by the fire of God's love to be made ready for heaven. So that's helping us to change our mindset. Okay? Second thing that we do is to kind of change our practices, what we do, right? So what if we let Halloween be a kickoff for a whole November's worth of focus on the last things, right? Death, judgment, heaven, and hell. We kick off Halloween with all of its skeletons and all of its death and its black and its gore even. And we say, okay, remember death, memento mori. You are mortal. You are going to die. The people that you love are going to die. And for many people, it's not going to be pretty either. It's going to be tough. For some, it's going to be painful. These are things that us stiff-necked Americans don't like to talk about. But it's true. And so we have been given this blessed time, as all of nature is lending itself to our meditation, to think about these things. And it's important that we do that. We don't miss the opportunity. So Halloween can really be a good impetus for that. Instead of celebrating Halloween and putting up the Christmas tree like Walmart does, and like I really want to do, spend some time in that dark place. Because it's not a bad thing to be in the dark if you realize who the light is. All right? But pretending there's no dark means that the light has nothing to offer you. Okay? Second thing, go to the cemetery. You know, it used to be a practice on Sundays when cemeteries were joined to the church. You know, so the church and the cemetery were conjoined. That people would go from church and they'd go into the cemeteries and they would take holy water from the church that day and they would bless the graves of their loved ones, and then they would sit and they would picnic on the graves of their deceased relatives. That's a beautiful thing. We don't spend a whole lot of time in cemeteries anymore. We might make solemn visits, right, where we go in, we change some flowers, and then we go out. But spending time in a cemetery, one, is a good way for us to meditate upon death. It's a good reminder for us to pray. And it helps to keep things in perspective. This life is passing. And when your senses are just all filled with restaurants and buildings and people having fun and all sorts of things, going to a cemetery where what your eye sees are here lies, here lies, here lies, here lies. It's an important thing. It's somber, it's macabre, but it's powerful and it's necessary. Now here's the other thing. If you're not going to observe All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, then don't celebrate Halloween. That makes no sense, right? Because what you're ending up doing is you're ending up taking all of the bad and all of the scary and all of the horror without any of the good. And that is going to contribute to a culture of death, not to a culture of life. You will just become the person who gets the high off of horror. And unfortunately, I think that's where modern Halloween celebrations have led people, right? They get a high off of being scared. You go into a haunted house and, oh my goodness, that's great, right? But if you're not grounding those experiences, if you're not grounding your horror and this death and this otherworldliness and the supernature with Christ and his saints and eternal life that is offered to you, it's gonna go real wrong real quick. So that's my piece of advice. If you're not going to celebrate All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, don't celebrate Halloween. It's not worth it. The fourth thing, research and explain the reasons behind all of the many different Halloween traditions that exist. Explain them to your children. Give them the reasons behind it. Tell them the history. With Wikipedia, you can find out anything about anything, right? And you can find out why we do these things, where they come from. And you can make those yearly things more meaningful, right? So let's talk about some of them. Some Halloween traditions, ways that you can help your families to kind of enter more into the spirit of the season or of the feast day of All Saints and All Souls. Okay? This is probably the most common tradition that we have at Halloween is trick-or-treating. Everybody does it as kids, and most people stay home to give candy out to people coming. Now, the practice of going door to door in costumes, asking for things, is as old as humanity itself. Okay? It is not particular to Halloween. You find things in ancient Greece where people would dress up as songbirds, right? So they'd put feathers on their bodies, and they'd go door to door, and they'd sing a little song, and they'd get money or some treat in response to that. The whole notion of Christmas caroling. You put on a costume, you go to somebody's door, you sing a song, and you hope they're going to give you some cider or some wassail, right? Right? It's as old as humanity itself. So Halloween also incorporates this tradition. It's an ancient practice, and it spans many, many different cultures and traditions. But its use during Halloween has two distinct heritages. So the first is the fusion of those Guy Fawkes Day celebrations with the American celebration of Halloween, right? So remember how Guy Fawkes, they would dress up in costumes, and they would go bug the Catholics and demand beer and cakes or whatever. So you have that going on. But then a real beautiful tradition also undergirds the practice of trick-or-treating. And it's something called souling. So what would happen is in the days before All Souls Day, people would bake these cakes called soul cakes. I've got a recipe for them right here if you want to write that down. It's long, so they bake these delicious little, I presume they're delicious, these little soul cakes. I'm sure at the time they were. It's not like they had a Snickers bar, right? So what would happen is that people, usually children, and usually poor children, would go door to door. They'd visit homes, and they would get a soul cake for going. And in return for receiving the soul cake, they would offer to pray for the repose of the souls of the deceased members of the family of that household. And they would say, not trick or treat, they'd say, souls for a soul cake. Pray you, good mistress, a soul cake. Or mercy on all Christian souls for a soul cake. Okay? You can see that it's pretty similar to what we do now with trick-or-treating. And this is actually the precursor to what we do with trick-or-treating now. This was very popular in England and in Ireland. And by 1920, when Irish immigrants had filled up the United States pretty well, it became customary in America. So In some places too, you wouldn't just get a cake. You get apples, you get fruits or money or something like that. So it wasn't just a cake. But I think it'd be great. Make those little cakes and say, here, have a cake, have a soul cake, and pray for my mother. And those kids are going to look at you and be like, but if you don't tell them, who's going to tell them, right? Why not? So that's one tradition. Pumpkin carving. Who doesn't love pumpkin carving, right? So the carving of vegetables, again, it's as old as humanity itself. They were doing it for decoration, they were doing it for utility, but the carving of vegetables is found in almost every civilization. The thing is that when you consider, especially these northern regions that can't grow many things, but can grow a hardy turnip like no tomorrow, a turnip became quite available, right? And you didn't have to worry about carving up something that somebody was going to eat because there were more than enough turnips available. More than enough, I'm sure. And so what they would do is in Ireland, these children who were going souling, going door to door, asking for soul cakes in exchange for prayers, took with them a little lantern that they made from turnips. And they would gut it out, and they would carve the outside so that you could put a candle inside, protecting it from the wind, and that would help them to see as they were going. And they called these jack-o'-lanterns, which really mean a night watchman, okay? That got all reappropriated with the legend of Sleepy Hollow, which was illustrated, the head of the headless horseman was illustrated with a pumpkin head, okay? But in these days, this was a turnip. Now what happened is that also the people in France figured, hey, we got another use for these turnips than eating them. So they were using them for lanterns as well. It was very popular all throughout the history of humanity to use vegetables as lanterns. They held candles and oil very well. And so for the Guy Fawkes Day celebrations, these people were parading in the streets with these little jack-o'-lanterns as well, with these hollowed out turnips. And by the 19th century, the boys figured out that they could have some fun with this. And so instead of just carving out, little lanterns, they decided to put faces in them. And they would have spooky faces and all sorts of different things, grotesque faces. And that was a little prank that became associated with Halloween. Now, when the Irish immigrants came to America, they brought this tradition with them. But they found that there was an even better, more useless commodity here, the pumpkin. And that those were a heck of a lot easier to gut and carve than a turnip was. And so what they did was they started carving pumpkins. And at that point, the tradition of having the faces carved in them was already well established. And so you have the jack-o'-lantern coming into American culture. You're not carrying pumpkins around, though, anymore for lights because they're too heavy, so you're using them mostly for display. So you're trying to create a little environment. Just a couple of other things. I don't think I have any more slides. The witch, another staple of Halloween, has nothing to do with the traditional observance of Halloween whatsoever. You know what happened? Greeting cards. The same time that the greeting cards were coming out, right? They were making Christmas greeting cards. Some Yahoo thought it'd be a great idea to have a Halloween greeting card, okay? Didn't fly, didn't stick. Apparently people didn't think sending greeting cards on Halloween made much sense. But one of the things that they did was they commercialized the witch. So they kind of perfected the witch outfit and everything. They put it on the greeting card. Now that stuck, even though the greeting card didn't stick. And so the witch became associated with Halloween. And that sort of set the stage for the inclusion then of all things creepy, right? So black cats, spiders, cobwebs, and then all of the other fanciful stuff. So monsters and everything as this is becoming a part of American culture. These things are becoming part of the modern celebration of Halloween. But as it is right now, it's very different than it was even 100 years ago. It's certainly different than it was 200 to 300 years ago. But Halloween is a pretty modern thing. And we Catholics are the ones that came up with it, our Irish and English Catholics. But it belongs to us, and we have a lot to gain from it spiritually, theologically, experientially. So I hope that with at least some of this information, you're able to go home, think about this in a different way, talk to your family about ways that you can celebrate this holiday. One of the things that a lot of families do, which I think it's a beautiful thing, is they kind of make Halloween very focused on the saints, right? So they have an All Saints Day party or something where they dress up like saints. I've seen people carve pumpkins like saints. They dress them up like saints, or they carve religious images in the pumpkins and everything. That's a great way to take some of these old traditions and to merge them with Christianity. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Don't skip over the spooky, scary side of this. Not just because that's fun, but because it has an effect on our spiritual lives. It has an effect on our spirituality. And what I think a lot of people miss now is a good appropriation of death and fear into their lives with the grace of Christ. So that would be my little 2 cents on Halloween.